So there's two, as I mentioned, suggestions for future legislators and discussion of the rules of the Senate. There are 22 of them. I mentioned I'll just share a few. Do not hesitate to take a short break while a procedural issue is worked out. Sometimes it is appropriate to take a break when tempers are short. In fact, laying a bill over for a day is often a way to get tempers to cool and a compromise amendment drafted. Rule 11, the reading of bills. There have been times when the minority party has asked that a bill be read at length. This is their right. I think this rule was created at a time when not every member of the Senate could read. This provision is actually in the Constitution, so it cannot be suspended even by a vote to suspend the rules. There may be times when, this is 16, there may be times when a vote is going the wrong way from your perspective and you believe either that some member is voting other than they intended or that you can persuade them to change their vote. What you need to do is switch your vote to the side which is about to prevail so that you are in a position to make a motion to reconsider, since only people who are on the prevailing side can make a motion to reconsider. Okay, freshmen, repeat that back to me. Consider this. 18, committees can meet at the mic, but this should be done rarely because it excludes the public. We all know about his commitment to making sure that this process was open, accessible to the public. As a matter of fact, he wanted people to feel invited here, even Republicans. This is a good one we've been talking about. Some of you may get there to the esteemed house someday. 22. When the President pro tem is presiding, he or she is to be addressed as Mr. or Madam President, not as President pro tem. President pro tem means president at a certain time. The time is when he or she is presiding. Write that one down. And I will just read a couple of the 10 from his suggestions for future legislators. Number 6, think of other members of the General Assembly as team members, even members of the other party. The goal is not to be in the majority. If that were the goal, then the other party would be the enemy. The goal is to make Colorado the best state in the country, or in any country for that matter. To do this, we need everyone's help. If we don't do this, we will be at a competitive disadvantage with states or countries that learn how to work better together. Number 9, don't let conflict escalate. Be the one who de-escalates. Be the bigger person. Be the person who acknowledges error. And if you have to, go outside and take a walk. Senator Mitchell thought that meant around the building on the ledge. And the last one I'll share of the 10, have pride in what you are doing. You stand on the shoulders of many thousands who have worked or shed blood for our rights and our democracy. Fewer than 2% of the people who have ever lived have lived in a democracy. Don't take it for granted. By your conduct here, honor those people who fought for this democracy. You know, I think back at all the times I ran into Senator Gordon and I said, we got to do lunch soon. Let's not say soon anymore, because you never know. Maybe the next time you run into someone that you really care about, that meant a lot to you, you say, let's do lunch tomorrow. God bless Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Minority Leader. Any other senators would like to speak? Seeing none, I'd invite any former members to come to the well to address the memorial. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first met Ken Gordon when he first ran for the House. I was the minority leader in the Senate at the time. and I went over to help him walk because I thought walking was good exercise, if nothing else. I was teaching a class at DU last night, and I walked out in the hallway, and I found this little note, which I wanted to share with you. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy that is translated through you. And because there is only one you in all time, the expression is unique. To me, that sounds so much like Ken Gordon, because in so many ways, he was unique. He was more intelligent than the average bear. I think that was pretty obvious. He took life seriously. He was a man of principle. And he seemed to have conquered this nasty habit we all have of putting our selfish interest before the interest of others. We, myself included, all too often are full of ourselves. We think that what we do here is so important. I've been gone a while. There were a lot of bills that I carried because I guess people thought, well, we used to call it, he can walk the aisle. He can talk to both sides. I don't know how many of those pieces of legislation that were so hard fought are even still on the books. I don't know that there was any contribution, if you will, to the state that lasted for a long time. But I'm hoping that the contributions that Ken made go far beyond the work that he did in this chamber. I think it may have more to do with the example that he set. Those of us in politics are very seldom on the wrong side of an issue when it comes to understanding where the people are. There is one exception, and it's a notable anecdote, I think, for Ken's life, because we now have seen 75% of the voters vote for an amendment to the Constitution that expresses their concern over the corrosive effect of money in politics. That happened in 2012. That's not far in the past. Citizens are concerned about outside money. They're so concerned about outside money that less than 10%, for the first time in the history of this country, believe that the people who represent us in Congress can actually solve the problems that we face. That's a very disturbing indictment of the whole representative process, if you think about it for a moment. If we have any responsibility at all, it seems like it's to save the institution, to restore that kind of confidence. I believe that that's what Ken was after. You say he cared about the institution, but I think he cared about it in those terms. Not to worship it as a god, but to think about the purpose of the institution. If we don't have the trust of the people that we propose to represent, how do we expect them to follow us? You ever ask yourself that question? We spend so much energy these days tearing one another down that by the time we get elected, nobody trusts us. What are we doing? What's going on with our political system? George Washington maybe was right, when he warned us about political parties. I was reminded when I came back here today, haven't been here in a while, that we've got this huge gap that separates us. We've even got 2 microphones up here. Are we afraid we're going to catch something from the other microphone? And here I am talking into the right one, right? I wish that when I had been in politics, set the kind of example that Ken Gordon set. I had this beautiful speech here. Man, I worked on this thing. Late into the night last night, up at 5:30 this morning, and I'm not even paying any attention to it. I apologize for that. But the thing that really impressed me about Ken was his independence. He was what is called an independent moral agency. One thing that we all care about, it would seem, is being somewhat free. We talk about having a free society. I think the reason that he was so concerned about money in politics is because, while we like to think that it doesn't affect us, come on. Come on. The lobbyists that give us the money must believe it affects our vote. It's an investment. They'd quit giving it to us if they didn't think it affected our vote. But we say, oh, it just gives us access, right? I'll listen to you if you do that. I hope that when we have another representative in Congress that they're willing to take my telephone call. Maybe it's going to require me to write a big check before that happens. We have a system now that's awash in politics, and so our other excuse is what? We say you can't be competitive unless you take their money. I know, this is uncomfortable, isn't it? That's what we say. We even insinuate that if you don't take their money, you're a little naive about the political process. I teach ethics now at the University of Denver, and I have for 14 years, and it's given me time to reflect on what I did here. I took money from special interest, and I had to listen to them. I remember one time we were voting on a bill that had some concern for some trial lawyers in town, and one of them had made a $500 donation to my campaign. I was voting the other way, and he came in and he was honest. He said, the reason you should vote with us is because we donated money to your campaign. And I said, well, can't you give me some rational reason why I should do that? There was this long silence, and he says, money's rational? Now money is speech, right? Thank you, Supreme Court of the United States. And between 2012 and 2014, money in politics increased by 400% from special interest. Our constituents do not believe us anymore when we tell them it's not persuasive. When we become dependent upon that money to be here in this chamber and think that we're something special, are we still going to tell ourselves that it's not persuasive? Ken was a very interesting guy. I think of him as being an Aristotelian. Aristotle talks about what the real purpose in life is. He says it's not wealth. It's not the accumulation of power. Those are just means to an end. The end that we seek is happiness, and he used a fancy Greek word for it, and I won't burden you with that. But it's not really happiness, it's fulfillment. It's being proud of the life that you lead, not having to apologize for anything that you do or you think. He said that the way that we become satisfied to that extent is we have to live a life that is virtuous. What does he mean by that, virtuous? Well, Aristotle was a practical philosopher. He always put things in the context of our work. He said we need to figure out what the virtues are that make us do our work better, and he always put it in the context of utility for the community. That's our constituents.
Senator Cassidy, 1 minute remaining. Sorry.
Now I remember the House.
Welcome to the better chamber.
Yeah, thanks. I feel welcome. This was Ken's authentic project, and he adopted those virtues which he thought were important and would make him serve the people better. And eliminating conflicts of interest was high on his list. When a wealthy person dies, the people that are left behind, they fight over the money. That's what he leaves. When a man of power dies, the people that are in line fight over the power. But you know, when a man of principle dies, the whole community feels that there's a hole that's left. And we're left with the question, who now will sacrifice their own self-interest to do this work? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Senator. President Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members. I hurried down here as soon as they invited us down because I've spoken after Andrew and Dan before, and learned that lesson the hard way. I didn't want to speak after them again. So, well, thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this tribute. It is really quite an honor. And I can't help but to think that it's slightly ironic as well. Because when I served with Ken in the Senate and he was a majority leader, he would spend half his time on the floor trying to discourage people from going to the microphone to speak. He liked to have a very comprehensive and succinct debate. And after he thought all of the important points had been made on the debate, he'd pull you aside as you're coming down and he'd say, "So what are you going to say?" And, well, I thought I'd make this point. Well, that point's already been made. Well, what else are you going to say? Well, nothing. Okay, you can sit down now, is kind of how he ran it. It made for good fun, I guess, on the Senate floor. A lot of people have told a lot of stories. I figured I'd tell a couple as well about Ken. There's just so many. We could sit here all day, literally, and swap stories. Several people met him for the first time when they first decided to run for office. I've heard that, Representative Peniston, you had a story very similar to mine. I was running for the state Senate in 2004, and the closer we got to the election, the more it looked like I might actually win. And somebody finally recommended, why don't you go down to the Capitol and talk to some of the state senators down there and try to get their support. So sure enough, I came down to the state Capitol and I visited with Ken. I remember sitting in his office. He was the minority leader at the time, so he was sharing an office with Joan Fitzgerald, and it was pretty crowded in there. I sat at the corner of his desk, and I think exactly the same thing. I think he was eating his lunch while we were having our conversation. And he looked at me and said, "So tell me about yourself." All right? And I wanted to impress him. So I gave him my whole resume. I went through the whole thing. I use this sometimes as an anecdote when I introduce myself to an audience. And I say, well, look, third-generation Coloradan, and went off to Stanford on an ROTC scholarship, and made 2 deployments on active duty when I was in the Navy to the Persian Gulf, and I came back, went to law school, and I practiced law here in Denver. And he kind of chewed on his sandwich, and he did this with his whiskers, and he looked at me and said, "Are you a felon?" And I kind of was thrown back by that. I said, "Well, no, sir, I'm not." He said, "Good, you're qualified." And I think that's when I realized that the bar to entry sometimes down here isn't really that high. After getting to know Ken a little bit better, though, I realized there was actually a better answer to that question. I should have looked him right in the eye and said, "Not convicted," and he would have really appreciated that. Shortly after that, we took the majority that year, so he became the majority leader in the Senate. And when he became the majority leader, majority leader of the Senate assigns all the committees. So he came to me and said, "So Brandon, what committees do you want to be on?" And I was very naive. I don't think I'd ever actually sat in a committee. I didn't know what committees were on the list. I knew I needed to knock on a bunch of doors and talk to a bunch of people, and that's how I was going to get elected. I hadn't really thought much about what I'd do once I actually took office. And I kind of fell back on what I was good at in my stump speech, because I talked a lot about public education. My wife is a public school teacher. I had young kids. And so I said, I want to be on the education committee. That's the only thing that matters to me. It's the only committee that I want to be on. He said, all right. Well, the next day I get my committee assignments, and I was on the finance committee, I was on the health and human services committee, and I was on the judiciary committee. And he came to me and said, you know, you need to learn something. And by giving you the breadth of experience, and not just giving you something that you feel comfortable with, I think you'll be a better legislator in the long run. So we'll give you a more diverse experience down there. And he was absolutely right. Having the opportunity to learn something about all these areas that I'd never been exposed to before was very helpful. A couple years later, I was the assistant majority leader. He was still the majority leader. And we were officed over there in the office suite, and I was right across the hall from him with my office. And it was late in the afternoon, and I was kind of just finishing up at my desk, getting ready to go home, and he steps into my office, and he says, Brandon, I got to ask you to do me a favor. Can you just entertain my request for a minute? Said, well, of course, Ken. What can I do? Anything for you. He said, well, don't be so sure. Need a favor from me. I said, okay. Well, what is it? He says, well, my girlfriend wants me to carry a bill. That's what he said. He said, my girlfriend wants me to carry a bill. And I said, okay. He says, well, I feel like I have a conflict of interest. I don't think I should be carrying a bill for my girlfriend. I think, it's an important issue and somebody should do it, but I don't know that it should be me. Maybe you would be inclined to sit down with her and see if it's something you're interested in. Well, what's it about? Well, it was autism, and it was helping kids who have autism. I said, Ken, absolutely, I'd be happy to do it. From that one conversation, I think we carried 4 pieces of legislation together over a 3-year period, and we passed a lot of very important things with, of course, Ken moving things right along behind the scenes. But Betty, thank you very much for all of your work. Thank you for supporting Ken and everything you've done for the autism community here in Colorado. Last story, and then I'll turn it over to the pros. A lot has been said about Ken's ethics, Ken's ability to live the life that a lot of us aspire to live. But there's nothing that spoke to me more than a committee hearing that I sat in with him. I think it was my second year in the legislature. He was running it as a chairman. It was a judiciary committee. Dan and I had an opportunity to serve in the judiciary. I think it was right after you had stepped out. And Ken was running the committee. And a controversial bill came up before the committee. And I think what it dealt with was sealing records. Felony records. So if you had a class 5 or class 6 felony on your record, after 10 years of being perfectly compliant with the law, it would allow you to seal the record so employers, when you went to try to get a job, couldn't see this blemish on your record. And the point being, a lot of these people, ever since they got a shoplifting conviction, convicted of theft for shoplifting, something of that sort, would have this blemish on their record for the rest of their lives. Every time they went to try to get a job, they just couldn't because somebody would see that in their history. So we're debating whether or not we give them the ability to seal their records. And as you can imagine, it became kind of a partisan issue, and it was a controversial bill. Well, a woman came to the table in the Senate committee room. And she was very well dressed and presented well, but you could see how nervous she was. She had a piece of paper in her hand with her testimony, and the paper is shaking kind of like this because she was so nervous. And you could see the perspiration start to gather on her brow and that sort of thing. And Ken said, "Stop." He said, "Stop. Ma'am, please understand, this is your room. The people around this table, they're your employees. They work for you, right? This building belongs to you. We're the ones who should be nervous, not you." That one conversation So important. See somebody of his stature, everybody looks up to him, to just stop the whole proceeding and demonstrate that he gets it in the big sense, what our democracy is supposed to be about, representative government. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for honoring Ken.
Senator Foster.
This is pretty tall. I understand there's a lever here somewhere. That's good. Well, thank you. Mr. Speaker, Madam President, never was able to say that. Mr. Minority Leader, my friend, Mr. Cadman, Senator Stedman, my friend. Family of Ken, my husband, who I think is the smartest clergy person in the universe and the best, and all of you, and to all of Ken's constituents who I'm sure are listening today and will be and are here with us in some form or another. Because Ken loved his constituents. Let me tell you who Ken Gordon was to me, and I'm going to be very brief. Ken Gordon came to me in 1993 and suggested I run for the open seat on the Denver City Council. We were at a breakfast, and Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who was our senator at the time, forgot to show up. So there was quite a bit of time. And he was a Democrat at that time, if I recall. That's why we were there. And so we had heard that there was an opening on the Denver City Council. Ken came to me and he says, "Joyce, you run." I said, "Ken, I think you are crazy." I said, "I don't even know how many people sit on the Denver City Council." Well, we all found out really fast. The race was only 12 weeks. He walked with me. He made phone calls with me. He raised money with me. And we walked, and we walked, and we talked, and we talked. And I won. I won without even, I just won. There were 5 of us in the race, and there was no runoff because I had the best campaigner. And from that moment on, he truly became my political mentor. You think he was your mentor? He was really mine. He was mine first. Well, maybe he knew you in a different capacity, but he was really mine. And Helen Shreves, his wife, his ex-wife, became my very first treasurer. It's kind of a family deal. And it was pretty wonderful. Pretty scary, I might add, but pretty wonderful. Before he had been elected to the state, Southeast Denver, believe it or not, was pretty Republican. I know it was before a lot of your time, but I'm sure some of you in this audience remembers that. And it was very hard to campaign in Southeast Denver because the neighborhood organizations were really run by Republicans, and they did not want to hear anything from any of us in Southeast Denver. So I was now elected, and once I took office, what I decided to do to keep people informed in Southeast Denver was to have, working with Ken, together we put neighborhood forums together twice monthly. But they weren't for Democrats, and they weren't for Republicans. They were for all of our constituents. And every elected official in our district was invited and encouraged to attend and talked. Senator Wham, Dorothy Gottlieb, school board directors, RTD directors, everybody talked about their issues. We talked issues. We did not talk politics. If you look in the Statesman every week, as I do, and I see all of the meetings that take place, the Democrats, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Republicans are all listed. We never even thought to advertise in the Statesman, but we were meeting twice a month in the evening so everyone could attend. And we met at different places all throughout the district. And then I said to Ken, I said, you know, Ken, we don't really know. In the city, we really don't know what's going on in the state unless you had been elected to the state and termed out, and now you were back in the city working, as we had a couple of senators. And I said, so it would be really helpful if you could come to perhaps a committee meeting from, now and again. This was in the early 90s. If you could come and share with people via the television, because we had television at that time, if you could talk about some of your bills, some of the bills that were going on in the Senate, bring whoever it was available, Democrat or Republican, to come and sit at the government committee meeting. And so we did that. And people had the opportunity to ask him questions and to debate respectfully and thoughtfully. And my friend Ken listened. He always listened. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Zach Zaslow, as many of you know, one of his fabulous aides. He was, and he shared this with me. Ken said, when I first started working for him, Ken told me the legislature is like this. You get up every morning and you fight for what you believe, and you never completely win, and you never completely lose. But the world is a better place because you fought. And he taught people, the people that worked for him, to listen, and this is what he believed wholeheartedly. Now, this is what you don't know. Ken would drop into my house unannounced, uninvited, but I'm a Jewish mom. He's a Jewish kid, and he knew he had a place to go. And so he would drop in my house, come on over, come in, open the refrigerator, check it out, and see what I was cooking, and sit down and eat. And I loved it. I loved it. But I obviously think he really liked my cooking because he came often. So he continued to return. Now, many of you may or may not know, but both Ken and I are from Michigan. A lot of people thought we were twins because we were both from Michigan. After I would tell them that I was considerably older than Ken, can you believe that? I really am. I'm about 7 years older than, I just celebrated my 70th birthday, and Ken was only 62 or 63. Yeah, he was much younger. And that I had more hair than he, so they were able then to tell us apart. So it was fun having Ken as a friend. He was my smartest friend, one of my smartest friends. I couldn't always understand him, and I made him clarify a lot of what he would say to me, because his first bill, I think, in the legislature was making sure the bills were in plain English. And, but it was still confusing. Anyway, but if you know me, you know I am not always serious. Ken was always serious. People have shared that he had a great sense of humor. And there were a couple of times over the last 3 decades that I saw it. Sorry, Ken, you really weren't that funny with me. You were more serious with me, but I loved you. During the off season, which was not really an off season for Ken, because Ken took this 120-day job and he worked year-round. But after the 120 days, Ken could be found at the gym near our houses. He always had bets going with his friends about who could lose the most weight. And I'm sure if I took a count right now, some of you were probably participated in those competitions. I don't know who won, who lost, but he was always competing somehow. Ken raised the bar for all elected leaders. He was filled with integrity, and to him it wasn't about the number of bills he passed, it was about how the bill would actually make someone's life better. He reminded all of us that there was no second chance or do-over on an environmental piece of legislation. It was much too important, as it would affect the planet forever. I've never forgotten that comment from him. That's one of his one of his Gordonisms, probably. I urge all of you to take home the copy of the resolution or the memorial resolution that you received this morning and read it. And then read it again and again. I know some of you, Democrats and Republicans, didn't always value and appreciate what he was doing. But then again, that's the sign of a great leader. Ken Gordon shared his leadership qualities with his staff. He was a one-man leadership academy, as many of them are in leadership roles today and making a difference. He asked them for their opinions because they mattered to him. Ken's constituents were loyal and loved him. During the early years, Ken and Helen's house was filled with people, making phone calls, dropping off literature, picking up more literature, and walking and walking and more walking.
Senator Foster, you have 1 minute remaining.
Okay. I know my dear friend Ken Gordon had many more plans and much more to do with his family. He would light up with mentioning Ben and Windflower and those grandchildren. And for the state. They say, man plans and God laughs. Ken, your foster family misses you more than you'll ever know. You were our legislator, our neighbor, our righteous man, and the most wonderful friend a person could have.
Thank you, Senator. Speaker Romanoff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to correct the record from the Senate Minority Leader's remarks earlier. There was not a vacancy when Senator Grossman took office, although there does appear to be one in Senator Cadman's district at this time. Ken Gordon loved his family who grace us with their presence today. Thank you. Thank you for sharing him with us. Ken was consumed by public service, and he knew that I was too. He didn't have a lot of faith in my ability to keep track of other activities, so he sent me an email last summer to fill me in. The first professional football game of the year, he wrote, is a week from Thursday. The Denver team, which is called the Broncos, is playing the Baltimore team called the Ravens. The Ravens beat the Broncos last year and went on to win the Super Bowl, or championship, he wrote. Our loss to them was caused by a last-second pass. This is what it is called when a player, usually the quarterback, throws the ball to another player. So when discussing this, he said it would be appropriate to look sad, but still defiant. He said the game is a home game, which means that it will be played at Sports Authority Field. Many true Bronco fans still call it Mile High Stadium, so you might want to use this nomenclature. Following the game, he said, you should know the score and the 2 or 3 crucial plays. These are what are the episodic events of the game are called. During the football season, it is usually considered appropriate to start conversations with, how about them Broncos? And then he said, I will keep you informed. Ken liked to have the last word in most of our conversations, and I want to offer him that honor today. A few weeks before he died, Ken sent me and a lot of you another email. The subject line read, shall not perish from the earth. This is, in part, what he wrote. Starvation, disease, and exposure killed nearly 2,500 American soldiers at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. At Omaha Beach during the Normandy landings in World War II, German soldiers manned machine guns in concrete bunkers that were nearly impervious to the weapons that the Americans had with them that day. Approximately 2,500 American soldiers were killed as they struggled to get from their landing craft to the beach. Democracy, Ken wrote, democracy, the sovereignty of the people, did not just materialize on the North American continent. It was created by people who knew the alternative and were willing to sacrifice for it. And yet, many Americans have not paid any price for our form of government. They don't know its value. Rome had a republic. Athens had a democracy. They were both lost. Ken said, there is no guarantee that democracy will survive. The key point in implementation of democracy is the election. One would like to think that the people who are involved in that implementation, the candidates, the campaign staff, the pollsters and consultants, do so with a form of reverence for the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf. What would that look like? Well, Ken said campaigns would be honest. They would not try to portray their opponent as less deserving than she is. Campaigns would honor merit. They would not try to win an election solely by outspending the other side. Campaigns would be informative. They would proudly confront the issues of the day and clearly state their positions on these issues. So, are campaigns honest, reflective of a candidate's merit, and informative? Well, no. Of course they aren't. Then I suppose Ken said one needs to ask, does this matter? The answer, he said, is yes. And then he wrote, in fact, yes, in bolds and all capitals. Ken was a walking exclamation point. He said, democracy can tolerate some dishonesty, some submission to money, and some ignorance. But there is a limit, and we are at that limit. Democracy needs a critical mass of people who respect it and believe in it for it to survive. Ken said, this isn't someone else's job.
Senator Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to be back in the House. Good to see everyone today, even on this occasion, and thank you for the privilege of being here. Senator Norma Anderson had to leave a bit ago, and so I wanted to say a few things that she asked me to say. She was the majority leader here in the House when Senator Gordon, then Representative Gordon, was the minority leader. And they worked the floor very well together, if you know both of them. She wanted to say that he followed her to the Senate, and that is exactly what he did. There was a lot of talk earlier about his following the rules and how much the Constitution and the rules meant to him. And Senator Anderson said it wasn't just the rules, it was the process that he followed. He followed the process that those rules laid out for us, and he made it fair for all. And that was the thing that I remember about Ken Gordon. Representative Gordon at the time and I were in the House for 8 years together in the minority. And I want to share with you the main lesson that I learned from him that I took with me for my 16 years. And that is, when you go into a committee room, sit with the friends on the other side of the aisle. Make friends with them, work with them. We are here to work together. And that wasn't too hard for me to do. That's my nature. So I became an independent like he. I became someone that did cross the aisle, did legislation all the time with my Republican friends, made friends in the Republican side. And I think that, and those were the great years. Those were the great years. I would say that going over to the Senate, yes, we do talk less in the Senate. We do have the 1-minute rule, and Ken's main rule that I will abide by now is, if it's been said, don't repeat it. Thank you, Ken.
Senator Grossman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you all for your patience today. To kind of dovetail on what Senator Williams just said, just about everything's been said, but not everybody's yet said it. So you'll have to bear with us a little bit longer. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel just a little uncomfortable with Ken being this big. He wasn't quite that big in real life. Ken and I were good friends. We served in both chambers together. We represented similar areas within the city and county of Denver. And we spent a lot of time together. And then when we were down here, we spent a lot of time together. When he sat in Representative Hollingworth's seat, I was just a couple chairs over. And in the Senate, when I was elected, not by a vacancy committee, but legitimately, I know most of you have been elected by vacancy committee, but that's a different story. When I got over to the Senate, he told me that he was going to put me right next to him, and when I asked why, I thought it was going to be some really good, important reason, and he said, because you're the only person who laughs at my jokes. And I have to say his jokes were pretty funny. So we entertained each other quite a bit, oftentimes during memorials such as this. And I remember one in particular, I don't remember which senator we were memorializing, but I leaned over to him, and it's totally fine if you guys have done this morning. And I said, you know, this is just an exercise for these has-beens to come down and talk about themselves in the pretext of honoring a fallen comrade. And he turned around and looked at me and he said, you just need to be more respectful. And he was right, because as time goes on and you do more of these, they start to become people you know, people you serve with, people you call a friend. And so that's what we're doing today. Ken was deeply moved, and everything he did down here was colored by the fact that he was in the minority most of the time that he was down here. And that added a lot to his perspective. He was always fond of saying, especially when we were in the House together and he was minority leader, he was very fond of saying that he envied the people who worked to beautify the state capitol and spent their days polishing the brass, cleaning the floors, and making this such a wonderful place, not just because they do good work, but because there's nobody over their shoulder telling them to, no, do it this way, or no, you can't do it that way, which is how he felt the minority was treated back in those days. I'm sure none of you can empathize with that. He was always attempting to reach across the aisle, and you've heard some anecdotes about that. One of his great ideas when he was minority leader was to have a basketball game, Democrats versus Republicans. I tried to explain it to him that might just exacerbate the partisan divide. Maybe we should mix up the teams, but he would have none of it. No, we're going to play basketball. It was about 2 or 3 minutes into the game, and he was wide open for a jump shot from the corner. He crumpled to the floor. The shot fell about 3 feet short. He totally torn his Achilles tendon. It was awful. He went to the emergency room. He was in a cast for I don't know how long. Helen, you probably remember. But the worst part about it was campaign season. And so he had this great excuse not to worry about walking his district and knocking on doors. He'll just use the telephone. But that wasn't Ken. And he and I were both out there campaigning, and he was faster than I was. He was on his crutches, and he was hobbling door to door. He would brag every night about how he knocked on more doors than I did, and he only had one good leg. He was tenacious, and he was committed. And that kind of bled over into the work that he did in this chamber. I'd also like to say about Ken that he was deeply intellectual about the issues that we dealt with, more so than I would say most of us consider a bill or any type of issue or a rule or any type of issue that we're debating. He liked to spend his time thinking a lot about why it was we were talking about this particular issue and why Republicans were coming down on one side and Democrats were coming down on another, and really get to the philosophical roots of the issues that we were talking about. It was really his way to find that path to coming together, something that doesn't happen very often in this chamber in a meaningful way. And one of the things that he said that has stuck with me through all these years when I talked to people about what it was like to serve in the legislature and what it was like to work with Democrats and Republicans. But what he said is we're not really that different. He said our values are just a little bit different. Republicans tend to really place a priority on freedom. And Democrats tend to place a higher value on justice. And as you can tell, there's a lot of overlap between those two values. And the trick is trying to figure out in that Venn diagram where it is that we can value both of those ideals and make constructive public policy. It felt like a political science class. I heard, I've heard people wax poetic about how he was in his teaching days, but it really stuck with me, and it's something that I think we can all bear to remember. Ken was a good man. He loved his family. He talked about them all the time. He did love this place, and he loved the good work that he was able to do, and he did it better than most, and I was honored to serve with him.
Representative Levy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really actually kind of nervous speaking here, even though I've done this so many times, because it's my one chance to get to talk about Ken Gordon, and I want to do it right. And I don't want to forget anything, I don't want to leave anything out, and I want to do him justice. And I'm really nervous that I'm not going to do it right. So I first met Ken in 1982 when he and Helen were running Southeast Denver for Federico Pena, when Federico Pena was running for mayor. And this was kind of an insurgent campaign because Denver had been run by the old white establishment forever. And along comes this young, handsome man who had a tilde in his name, and he was gonna change the culture in Denver. And I was brand new in town, and I wanted to get involved, and I got to meet Ken and Helen, and their house was this beehive of activity. And we've been friends ever since. Ken was a criminal defense attorney. I was a public defender. I was in the appellate division. And, when you're in the appellate division, you're sort of supposed to be the brain trust for the rest of the system. And this was before the days of Lexis and Nexus and computerized research. And I had a metal box that I kept file cards in, and every Monday the Supreme Court cases were announced, and I think it was every Thursday the Court of Appeals cases were announced. And I would take those cases and I would do a subject matter line, and then I'd write a little about the case, and I'd file it, and I had this elaborate system. And Ken, and I want to talk about that photo in a minute, but Ken would call me up, and he would just, the phone would ring, and I'd pick up the phone. I think we might have even still had rotary dials back then. But, I'd pick up the phone, and this voice would just say, what was that case that held blah, blah, blah? And I'd say, hello, Ken? And he'd say, oh, sorry. Hi, Claire, this is Ken. How are you? And then I'd tell him, what the case was that held blah, blah, blah. Or, he'd call up and he'd say, I need a case that says this. What's the case? But Ken was the most amazing criminal defense lawyer. We've heard a lot about what kind of senator and representative he was and what kind of politician he was and how much he believed in what he did. But he was the most tenacious, most thorough, most dedicated criminal defense lawyer. And it showed in the kinds of cases that he would take on, and it showed in the results that he achieved. So, and he did big cases and he did little cases, and I'll talk about a couple of those. In the little case, relatively variety, back in I think it was in the 80s, a bunch of people encircled Rocky Flats as a protest against manufacturing nuclear weapons. And of course they were all arrested for trespass. And of course they were all guilty. And he convinced me and a bunch of other people that we were going to represent all those people. And I said, oh, Ken, come on. What are we going to say? And he said, well, They just want their day in court. They just want to be able to explain to a jury why they did what they did. And it's so you don't have to win, you just have to get them to a jury so they can explain what this principle was that led them to commit this act of civil disobedience. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And I thought, okay, I did a good job here because my defendants, and we all had a bunch of them, I don't know, 5 or 6 of them, well, they actually got to explain to this jury. They still were found guilty, but they got to explain to this jury. Well, Ken, of course, got a not guilty verdict for his defendants because he would look at them, and he brought this to everything. You'll see his left eyebrow is slightly raised. That Ken would lean over like that, and he would raise that eyebrow. I can only raise my right one. I never mastered the left one like he did. But he would raise that left eyebrow, and he would look at people, and he would say what he believed in, and he would talk about the principle, and you just couldn't not agree with him. You couldn't not listen and find some important principle in that. A big case Ken had was a death penalty case. And there were 2 brothers, Chris and Frank Rodriguez, who had committed what many people felt was the crime that if anybody deserved the death penalty, it was these 2 brothers. And he represented Chris. He was not a public defender, and a public defender represented Frank. And I spent as many hours as I could in that courtroom watching Ken fight for this young man's life. And he fought for this man's life. And he would talk about justice in the abstract. He would talk about these principles that he brought to this chamber. And he got a life sentence for Chris Rodriguez. Frank Rodriguez got the death penalty, which I think was later overturned. And Chris died of hepatitis C in prison. But he would take cases that were unwinnable, and just through his persistence, he would turn people around. And that was Ken. And that photo, it's right because it's got the raised eyebrow. But most of the time, Ken was a really dour person. They're all, yeah. Mark knows. His kids know. Helen knows. He was dour. He was very serious because he felt the weight of everything, and he took everything so seriously. But he would tell these jokes, which you've heard about. But when he would start the joke, he would have this just deadpan look on his face, and you didn't know where this was going. And then he would do the punchline, and his face would break up, and he had this funny, goofy laugh.